Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Clarke, and I'm here with...
I am Rick Gatteau. Good afternoon, everyone. And today we're going to be talking about how race, class, gender, and sexuality manifests in American pop music and culture. And we are so happy to be joined today by Kevin Holt, Assistant Professor of Critical Music Studies at Stony Brook University. So thank you, Kevin, for being part of today's episode.
Thank you.
Great. So you are an ethnomusicologist. I've never said that word before until today. So can you share what is that exactly and tell us more about yourself and your area of study?
Well, I want to start out by pointing out that in Inside Out 2, in the sequel, there is this weird joke of, she's questioning, what will I be when I grow up? And she's like, maybe an ethnomusicologist. And she's like banging on drums with a question mark over her head. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of what it is, where it is. So it has, ethnomusicology as a field has a really varied history. It comes kind of out of a desire to explore the music of non-Western people and, outside of the classical world. So it was sort of, at one point, if you are an ethnomusicologist, you're doing all the things an ethnomusicologist does, just for some people over there. Since then, there has been a real shift. So I'm an ethnomusicologist because I employ ethnographic methodology and some approaches that are grounded in sociology and anthropology in my music-based research. So I like to tell people I study people and culture through music and sound.
So your book stems from your doctoral dissertation, Get Crunk, the performative resistance of Atlanta hip-hop party music. First, for our listeners who don't know what crunk means, if you can explain that. And second of all, can you kind of give us a little framing around your doctoral dissertation?
Okay, sure. So crunk, there are a few ways we can take this because this was a term that existed in Southern hip hop for a while, but in the early 2000s, it was used to define a subgenre of music that was coming out of Atlanta. So the subgenre actually has roots in Memphis, where they were creating all of this kind of aggressive club music that was built around chanting and almost moshing together, right? And they took this word that was used to describe that dynamic, and it became the name of the genre. And so my research looked at crunk music. When I first got started on this research and this inquiry, I was kind of looking around, and within hip hop studies and music studies in general, there was a real emphasis on only looking at the lyrics of hip hop, right? Hip hop as poetry, which is important. Mm-hmm. But when you have this music that's based around chanting and repetition, suddenly like, oh, it's bad poetry, so it must be bad hip hop. And I was like, well, you're kind of missing something. You're missing the important thing that this music is doing. So I just started out by saying, well, you have to contextualize this music. And contextualizing it means looking at histories that impacted Black youth in Atlanta. So looking at the histories of policing Black youth, especially in public space. Looking at the rise and fall of Freaknik, which is another thing that people may or may not remember. There's a Hulu documentary about it now, but it was a spring break event that catered to historically Black colleges, and it really blew up, and there was a lot of panic surrounding it. And I even take it to the Atlanta child murders, the missing and murdered children of Atlanta, which happens from 1979 to 1981. And, this is a terrible part of the city's history where there were young Black people who showed up missing or were found murdered, officially 30 people. But very importantly from my research, that was a formative memory for these people who would make this music that's about being loud and taking up space. Mm-hmm. And so I put all of that in conversation, all of those experiences and how they sort of thread together to create a music or to inform a music that is about sort of declaring your presence. And that is what the dissertation focuses on. And the book is actually upcoming this summer. So.
Oh, that's exciting. Oh, wow. Well, give us the plug for the book.
Yeah, please do.
The name of the book is actually I Bet You Won't Get Crunk. So I changed it up. But yeah, it's published with Oxford University Press, and it is set to be released this September.
Was it a labor of love?
It was, it absolutely was a labor of love. Sometimes when you focus too much on the labor, you forget that you actually do love it. But yeah, it's all of those things in the dissertation and some more things I was able to thread through. One other aspect that I really got to spend a lot of time with is looking at dance crews that started in the roller rinks of Atlanta, and they're still dancing and they're still sort of talking about those experiences and those histories. But all of those things kind of inform the music that was coming out of Atlanta, and that is in a nutshell what the book does.
Exciting! Really happy
Absolutely.
for you. So you shared a bit about how music is rooted in history. Can you talk more about how music has connected to social change and some examples where you've seen that?
Absolutely. So in some ways, it's history changes music and music changes history, right? So from the most straightforward, as context changes, as language changes, as people, desire new things, that just drives shifts in music. At the same time, just what I talked about with Crunk, all of those things that might seem disconnected, right? They're all informing people's experiences, and it's driving them to address those things aesthetically, right? So you have people who are pulling from, let's say, if people are protesting something, well, the sound of that protest often comes in and informs the music. And at the same time, often you'll have people who will pull on music and, create music that wants to persuade somebody or assert something. Sometimes music calls for people to create something that sounds angered. And sometimes music is calling for calm or peace. All of those things sort of invite music to change based on what's happening historically. And at the same time, we can look at the way that certain songs or certain musical moments really do get at the heart of a community or of a moment in history. And it inspires people to feel like they are of one community or one accord. It inspires the change. And I think really significantly here, it's one thing to tell somebody, that something needs to happen. It's another thing to feel that need. And often music has the dimension of affect, right? Has a dimension of it where we understand the emotion of it, even at times where we don't necessarily understand what's being said. So music becomes a means of wedding the feeling and the stakes to whatever's being expressed.
I appreciate how you talked about music kind of evoking an identity, a period of time. And I think it's so interesting that you can say things in music you can't say in regular speak. And it gives you an opportunity to resonate because people are singing your lyrics.
Right.
And so what is really interesting, and of course every period has their identity of music, and you think about the 50s and the rock and roll, and you think about, so many different periods of time. But when you're anchored in that period, that music means something to you. So you want to talk a little bit about, how people become so incredibly defined by the music of their period.
So one thing that I think is really important to note is how the soundscape that you inherit sort of coincides with your own development, right? So for a lot of people, well, when you become a teenager, when you kind of transition into that moment of life, you're a teenager or a younger adult, you suddenly become so much more social. Suddenly it makes, it matters so much what other people think. It matters so much, you get more philosophical. Like all of those things are sort of braiding in together. And that is also where we see a lot of people doing a lot of self-making work with music, a lot of very specific type of self-making work that stays. So the music that you're listening to when you're a teenager to a young adult, that tends to define the taste of your music for life.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, so much so that sometimes you'll have people who kind of don't understand the music that's coming after them, or certainly not the music that came before them. They'll rail against their parents' music. Although I will say at other times you can feel very nostalgic for, the music that your parents used to listen to. It feels like a real connection. Mm-hmm. I'll say that, again, it's that same thing. It's the music expressing something important of the affect, right? It's not just I'm expressing this philosophy or I'm making these connections. It's that suddenly that feeling is expressed by this music that I'm listening to at the time. And this and especially is important when we think about like being a part of a subculture or community, which many of us also do when we are sort of finding ourselves in that transition to adulthood. So yeah, I'd say that it becomes so very personally important to sort of soundtrack the soundtracking that you do at that time. And it really just stays with you.
It's making me think of the kind of the soundtrack of your own life. I mean,
Yes.
you listen to a song evoke so many memories in your own life. So there obviously, Judi brought up obviously the 50s, 60s, and the evolution of music. Can you talk a little about other genres of music, for example, hip hop party music, and rap? Kind of the differences between them, and kind of where is music today?
Oh, where is music today? Where isn't music today? There's so much popular music history, which you can learn about if you take one of my courses. Just throwing it out there.
Great. No, I have a book to read and a course
and
today.
a course.
Sign me up.
But all of those, there are so many important interventions that happen with all of those things. And some of them are huge interventions like rock and roll. Suddenly music is less polite.
Yeah.
And which kind of stands as a real rebellion against the kind of sanitized normalcy of the 1940s in the U.S., right? That very post-World War II kind of investment in normalcy. I could go genre by genre, but I was asked about hip hop. I will focus on the distinctions between hip hop party music, and rap. Was it?
Right,
Yeah.
rap, yes.
Sometimes these get used kind of interchangeably, but I will draw some distinctions for me. So the first thing is, it's interesting to use hip hop party music as a distinction because hip hop started in parties. It started as party music. And so, in the 1970s in the Bronx, when you had these kind of unofficial block parties, that's where you had people kind of experimenting with, playing with those old records and scratching them up and vocalizing over the beats. And it was a party. But somewhere along the way, there was a shift that happened where the idea was that the default hip hop was the re-roll. It was about, a more passive listening and not something as active or dynamic as the party. So when the party never really went away, right? There's always been party music.
Yeah.
But, when I say hip hop party music, I'm talking specifically about music that's about being active, that's calling for a direct kind of back and forth engagement. And, as, distinguished from the kind of listening you do like on your own, the communal aspect of being sort of in audience. And rap, some hip hop purists would say that rap is, just kind of one of the elements of hip hop. Often when people evoke hip hop, they think of the totality of hip hop culture, which includes, breaking, it includes DJing, some would say beatboxing, some would say, all of those aspects. But sometimes hip hop kind of gets reduced to just rapping, and to the detriment of all those other elements. So some people are very strict about, being intentional about saying, I'm talking about hip hop, all of it. And versus I'm talking about rap, just this aspect. But as I said, there are some people who use rap and hip hop kind of interchangeably. And I don't push back against that. If those words make sense to you, then, they're doing work out there. It makes sense because rapping was kind of seen as one of the primary musical interventions of hip hop culture. And so when people talk about hip hop music, a lot of times they're thinking rap, even though you can have hip hop music that doesn't center rap. Scratching is hip hop music that doesn't center rap necessarily.
So How does one's identity manifest in pop music, like through race, class, gender, sexuality? Because I think things are very socialized and very defined within the lyrics, within who's performing, who's not performing, how they're performing, who's in front of the stage, who's in the back of the stage. So can you talk a little bit about, how one's identity has manifest in pop music? And then a quick one would be just kind of the grace. Should music be seen as an art form that requires respect, even if one might not appreciate the music or what that body of work represents? So a two-parter, your identity, and then that incredible curiosity and grace.
Okay. When I think about music and identity, the first thing that comes to mind is that music never emerges in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's always doing some sort of symbolic work. Whether, people like it or not, there is some aspect of music that people assign identities to. Music doesn't have a body, but we are always sort of imagining a body, or even in music without, a singer, we are imagining a space or a context. And so that allows music to do a lot of very important symbolic work on the level of identity. So what we listen to, what gets platformed, what directions different genres go in, all of those reflect a conversation about how people understand identity and experience, even if that's rendered somewhat neutrally, right? Because there are, let's say, for instance, if we think about like Motown, for example, Motown is it's a style of music that a lot of people feel a connection to, but Motown emerges at a certain time in a certain place with a certain politics.
Yes.
And keeping that in mind helps to ground some of our understandings of why it sounds the way that it does. So for Motown artists of the 1950s and 60s, many of them were trying to cross over.
Yeah.
This is happening during a time where there are a lot of limits on the level of success that's afforded to Black musicians. And they wanted to gain wider audiences. So they tweaked their sound a little bit to fit, to not be too, let's say, rough in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But that preferencing of smoothness, it's been a part of the soundscape that existed around. It was just about those strategic shifts to try to make sure that it found its larger audience, and it was successful. It's one reason why everybody knows My Girl.
Yes, right.
And I'd say that there are aspects of music beyond even just the lyrics that often signal something of identity, and oftentimes it hovers around in areas that even musicologists don't always talk about. Timbre, the quality of the sound, or even register how high or low a sound is. Often that has implications for, the size of the instrument or the voice making it. Things like groove, which are, really kind of slippery concepts, that really has an impact on where people imagine certain sounds or what people will be doing in response to the music. So, all of these, all throughout there's an underlying, sort of commentary on identity. And because of that, often when people feel that they want to say something about a group of people or an identity, historically, they've said things about their music as well. Is this music valid? Is it important? Is it thoughtful? Or is it just sort of something that just, kind of pours from this community and isn't well thought through? All of those things translate directly to the way that the makers of those styles of music are received. Grace.
Yes.
Music, I'd say, is really, really important. There are only a few things that exist in every culture. Every culture has language. Every culture has a science. Every culture has art. Every culture has philosophy. Every culture has music. And so sometimes it's a bit disregarded, as fluff. One of my professors used to say, or he posed the question, is music cheesecake? And by that he meant, if cheesecake disappeared tomorrow, we'd miss it. We'd probably tell our kids about how good cheesecake was. They might tell their kids, but life would go on. We'd be okay without cheesecake. So is music cheesecake, or is it something more essential? I'd say first, the fact that it exists in every culture and every context tells us that there's something about music that reflects how we relate to each other, that reflects something deeply entrenched in how we understand humanity. And also just casual observations. People hear their music and they feel very, very strongly about it. It does some work for them internally and communally. And, for that, it deserves some sort of conversation, some sort of focus. Even if you don't like the particular type of music it is, I think the thing to focus on is acknowledging that this music is important to somebody.
Yes.
If it means something to somebody, that is enough. And we can't say that, there is a music style that everybody loves or that everybody understands. But we can acknowledge that it's always doing something for somebody. And that tells us something about those people that it does that work for.
Interesting. Can you talk a bit about pop culture today in America? Who gets to define what it is? And I'm curious about the artists themselves versus corporations who are putting out music. Who's defining what pop culture looks like? Who has the power in that space?
The algorithm. No. Well, yeah, it's so there are a couple of sides to it. It could be it's kind of co-created, right? The artist puts something out, and you have whatever system of diffusing that art. It could be the internet, which really is beholden to an algorithm.
Yeah.
Like something gets pushed forward, something gets pulled back, or it doesn't get promoted as much. Or you have more traditional roots like the radio, who has the backing of a major company. At the same time, and I always sort of point to this, it's the listeners who infuse it with a lot of meaning. Because the artist has, they have an intention when they create the music, but the listeners are the ones who sort of inject it into their everyday lives, who connect through it, who make it have an impact, right? So we kind of co-create through our continued listening. We kind of create a canon. And I guess sort of officially, you have things like museums and textbooks that tell us, like, this art is important or this music is important. But I think it still pales in comparison to how we as the audience, as the receivers and the people who share this music with the people that we care about or use it to mark the progression of our lives. Those are the meaning makers.
And can I just follow up with in the evolution of social media today too, and TikTok, has that created more opportunities for to go more unconventional routes for people to then get their music out to the public?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we got a lot of experimental music coming out of SoundCloud in the 2010s because it was so new. Now, that said, the internet today isn't as democratized as it once was. So now, getting back to the idea of the algorithm. But one great thing about the internet as a medium is that, well, you can find a niche audience and amass a huge niche audience. So no matter what, you can find your people, in the most romanticized of times. You can find an audience. And what that has done is it's allowed people to think beyond the confines that were set by, large media corporations. For instance, back in the 1980s, the Black Rock Coalition was created. Mm-hmm. And one of their gripes was that they were interested in creating rock music, but the major companies were not really interested in sort of promoting Black rock musicians, or they weren't sure that they could get back, their investment. And so you have a whole coalition created of musicians that are just, their main gripe is, I make music in this genre and people don't want to see me in this genre, or the people who are signing folks. With the space of the internet, you have more people who are like, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna make a trap country music fusion and I'm just going to throw it out there, and it gets big, and now Lil Nas X is well known all over. You know?
Exactly.
We have more experimentation, or you have more people who are, you know, playing around with things that maybe the established industry wasn't quite as interested in backing. And that is one of the positive, you know, outcomes of the rise and the significance of the internet and contemporary media.
So I'm in, life is cyclic. Music is cyclic. I feel like the cycles are getting shorter. And so when we think about music, it's so funny when I'm talking to young people and I'm singing the lyrics to a song because it's like the 15th remake of it. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, are we losing a little bit of our creativity? Because we're really good at taking existing music and making it, you know, current period music. But we don't hear a lot of new creations where literally it's a song you've never heard before. It's a cluster of music notes you've never heard before. It's like and it lights you up because you don't, you know, most of the time it sounds like something else. But do you think we're getting a little atrophy in our creativity on our original music?
Well, I'll start by saying that is a concern that has existed for a long, long time. So Theodore Adorno was talking about jazz smoothing our brains in 1930, 1934. But it's kind of a persistent concern. Like, you know, are we becoming less creative? Are we just replicating what existed before? And I think it's a fair question to explore. Two things come to mind. The first is that there are shifts in how we approach music making, right? So partially because of, you know, the musical interventions of hip hop, which, you know, pulled from soul records and created new tracks out of them, we have a new sort of frame for sort of creation, right? The idea that we can create something wholly new or breathe new life into something that was lost and forgotten. You know, they were literally pulling records, which by that time were kind of an antiquated medium, and creating something that the original creators probably couldn't have anticipated. That's the first thing. The second thing I'll bring in is sometimes there is a shift in focus for music. And when that shift in focus happens, you might have some listeners who don't really understand the new thing that's happening. A kind of recent-ish example, when mumble rap emerged, this made a lot of people very uncomfortable because hip-hop's supposed to be about, you know, poetry, and I can't understand what you're saying. You just sort of, you know, like, what are we supposed to be focusing on here? And what had happened, I'd argue, was that it was a shift from making sure that the words are fully articulated to a conversation about creating this interesting texture. And so it's in some ways it was a shift from the rapper to the producer as the realm of creativity. You know, suddenly we have music that simultaneously sounds underwater and echoey, you know, that didn't exist before. And I'll say one more thing. Music making historically is far more communal and far more referential than it initially feels. Even, you know, many of the great classical composers, they're referencing other composers, kind of an old practice, but we don't canonize it that way. Mm-hmm. You know, we sort of see them as the great folks intervening. And the important thing there to acknowledge is, you know, we do that because the idea that great music sort of exists in a bubble or it comes, you know, out of the mind of somebody who is a forward thinker disconnected from their community, that sort of renders a sense of importance. And we often reproduce, you know, genius rhetoric, genius points in the music that we listen to. I'm sure we can think of, you know, one or two people like, oh, there was only one Whitney. You know, there was no one before and there will never be another one. You know, but really, I think there's something beautiful about acknowledging the ways that the musicians are influencing each other. It's happened before. Just in the past, we haven't been given credit. Yeah. And, you know, now we're more we offer more credit. That's one reason why, if you read written by on the liner notes, it'll have 20 people as opposed to 2.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, we just wanted to thank you so much today for sharing your incredible insights and expertise. And we look forward to reading your newly published book this summer. So
And
can you
taking
give
this
us
class.
and taking your class?
Thank you.
Wait, one last plug opportunity for the book. Let's hear
Oh
it.
yeah, the book is "I Bet You Won't Get Crunk." Oh my gosh, what's the subtitle? I'm blanking on the subtitle. I bet you won't get crunk. Keep an eye out for
Right.
it.
We'll put it on the website when it's ready.
Thank you.
So we hope our listeners find these discussions informative and empowering as we navigate these times together. Thank you again to our guests for your incredibly valuable contributions.
Yeah, we look forward to having you join us again for next week's episode. For now, I'm Rick Gatteau.
And I'm Judi Brown Clarke. Thank you for tuning in.